Now we can finally get to the end of this chapter. Chapter 10 is really quite a beast. We can finally look at the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework for Keynes. And this is ultimately what it is going to look like once we explain it all. Here's our real GDP. Here's our CPI. Here's our aggregate demand. Maybe it looks like that. And then aggregate supply is the weird part, right? This all looks like the classical model so far. But here's the aggregate supply, and this is what's going to be unique for the Keynesian model. Aggregate supply he has going completely flat across and then completely vertical. That's how he thought it was shaped. We're going to have to explain everything that's in this graph here, but just to give you a little taste of the stuff that you're used to, okay? And discuss the things that are similar to what you've seen before. Aggregate demand operates very similarly to what we saw in classical economics. It operates similarly in the shape, okay? Remember, aggregate demand was downward sloping because of the real balance effect, international trade effect, and the interest rate effect. That still applies to the aggregate demand curve here. So the lower the CPI, the more the consumers want to spend their money and buy goods and services. So aggregate demand looks pretty similar, but just remember that aggregate demand is very susceptible to changes, to shifts, due to the multiplier effect. We learned in the last video the multiplier effect results from the fact that if I spend my money, someone else gets it, and they're going to spend a portion of it too, and then it gets spent again and again and again and again. So aggregate demand can easily shift right or left, because if it shifts a little bit right initially, then the multiplier effect is going to cause an even bigger shift to the right after that. So aggregate demand, pretty similar to what you've seen before. Aggregate supply is what looks so different, okay? So let's talk about aggregate supply. All right, and the first thing I want to mention is to notice that there is no, short run, long run component of aggregate supply, like we saw in classical economics, right? Classical economics, you have short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. They're two different things. But in Keynesian economics, there's only one time period, okay? The time period represented in Keynesian economics is essentially the short run, okay? Is now. And the short run is all Keynes cares about. Because after all, in the long run, according to Keynes, we're all dead. So he's not going to focus on the long run. He's going to focus on today. He's going to focus on today and tomorrow, right? Because those are the time periods we live in. But let's not focus on what's going to happen 3 years from now. Let's focus on what's happening now. So the aggregate supply curve that you're going to see in the Keynesian model has no long run component. It really is just the short run, okay? The second thing we need to talk about is the shape. And this is going to take a decent amount of time to discuss. This is the hard part of this video that I'm showing you now. So here's our CPI. Here's our real GDP. Here's our aggregate supply. And here's our aggregate demand. Okay, and we kind of just going to have to describe everything as we go here. It's going to be hard to stay just on one topic because we got to learn all of this simultaneously. The vertical portion without even discussing why it's vertical, let's just first tell what it shows. The vertical portion, this shows the maximum production. The maximum production of this economy, which we can describe as the natural real GDP. Okay? We've learned about the natural real GDP before. It's the real GDP when the economy is operating at full potential. And for Keynes, this is the amount here. Okay? So this is the natural real GDP. Keynes isn't so worried about inflationary gaps because inflationary gaps means the economy is good today. And Keynes is worried about today. He's not worried about the long run. So the natural real GDP is a little bit different for Keynes. Unemployment rate is not necessarily just 4.5% here. Anything 4.5% or lower would satisfy maximum production. Okay? And so this aggregate supply curve where it's vertical shows the natural real GDP. All right? Completely separate from that, the equilibrium still does exist. And it's found where aggregate supply and aggregate demand meet. All right, so right here will give us our actual real GDP as well as our CPI and our current economic state. So here's our CPI, here's our real GDP, and here's our natural real GDP. So what have we drawn up here? This is a recessionary gap, okay? So in this specific example, we have a recessionary gap where the real GDP is less than the natural real GDP. And Keynes would recommend that the government get involved to try to fix this through expansionary fiscal policy, cutting taxes, raising government spending. We'll get back to that discussion at the very end of this video, but first we need to figure out why is this part flat and why is this part vertical. Aggregate supply doesn't look at all like it did for classical economics. Right? In classical economics we had the short run, we had the long run. We talked about why the short run is upward sloping, sticky wage theories, misperceptions. Here it looks completely different, and the logic is actually completely different. There's really not any similarities in the aggregate supply curve between classical and Keynesian economic beliefs. Okay, so first, let's focus on the flat part of aggregate supply. Okay, so I'm basically just redrawing what we just had. And I want to know what's going on here and why is this portion of it flat. So let's imagine here's our economy and what appears to be a really painful recessionary gap with our real GDP far below the natural real GDP. Okay? So let's consider this current situation. I'm going to label this AD1, okay? AD with a little 1 right here because we're going to draw some new aggregate demand curves up here. At AD1, let's think about how this economy looks. The production is way below the natural real GDP, okay? So the real GDP is way below the natural real GDP, meaning this economy is doing a lot worse than its potential. What can we assume about the economy then? We can assume that there's a lot of unemployment, okay? Lots of unemployment. Specifically, the unemployment rate must be more than 4.5%, more than the natural. If we're at the natural, then we would be equal to the natural real GDP. So there's lots of unemployment. There's probably also lots of unused capital, right? If these workers aren't working, it probably also means there's lots of capital not being used. A lot of vacant buildings, desks that are empty, computers not being used, lots of resources not being used. So lots of unused capital, lots of unemployment, probably natural resources aren't being used, and there's probably not a whole lot of entrepreneurship going on as well. Keynes just has a word for these types of things not being used. He calls them idle resources. be careful here. Idle, I-D-L-E. Idle means it's not being used, okay? So if you put ideal resources on the exam or idle resources, I-D-O-L, those mean very different things, and I'm going to not give you full credit for that answer. Idle resources are resources not in use. Okay, so idle resources are resources that are not in use. And any point on this flat part on the aggregate supply curve, there are unnecessary idle resources. So the economy has lots of idle resources. Okay? Again, any point on this flat curve, we have lots of idle resources. The reason is, if we're on this flat part, we must be in a recessionary gap, meaning the real GDP has to be less than the natural. So there must be people not working, capital not being used, and so forth. Okay? So let's imagine, in blue here, switching to kind of a new time period, let's imagine that aggregate demand increases. Just imagine this occurs for whatever reason. Let's not care about why for now. Let's just say it does. And let's say it increases to aggregate demand 2. What that's going to do to our economy is the real GDP is going to increase to this level here. So we get more real GDP. And the CPI is not going to change, right? We were here to begin with on this flat part, and we're still there now. So why? Well, the question is why? Why doesn't the CPI change? Why doesn't aggregate supply go upward sloping so when aggregate demand increases, aggregate supply, the CPI goes up? So don't write this down, but just to be clear about what I'm talking about here, this is what it looked like for classical economics. Here's our real GDP. Our short and aggregate supply is upward sloping. So if aggregate demand rises, the CPI would increase, okay? So short and aggregate supply was upward sloping. But in our case, aggregate supply is flat and then vertical. So the question is why? When aggregate demand increases to aggregate demand 2, why is this flat? Why does that lead to the CPI not changing? Well, here's the logic. And let me give you an example. I'm going to erase this, and let me give you an example that I've used in class that I think is really helpful for understanding what's going on here. So as a metaphor, imagine this is a restaurant. Imagine what you're seeing over here is a restaurant, okay? When we're in AD1, what does this restaurant look like? All right, this is what we're producing and the consumers are consuming, and here's our potential. This is like a really empty restaurant. There's a few people in there eating, but there are lots of idle resources. There are lots of cooks that are standing around waiting for an order to cook. The waiters and waitresses are looking at their phones, waiting on more customers to come in, right? Just kind of killing time. Lots of idle resources. Tables out there not being used. Just a lot of idle resources. So what happens is when aggregate demand increases from AD1 to AD2, the restaurant is easily able to serve these customers. So for example, imagine you're working at a big restaurant and a van of people shows up. Maybe there's a dozen people in this van. Maybe it's a high school basketball team. And they get to your restaurant and they walk in. The cooks aren't working, right? The waiters are working a little bit, but not much. And there's a bunch of empty seats. So when this van of people comes in, you say, yeah, sit down. We'll serve you. Pretty easy to serve these people because you have lots of idle resources. Idle resources are the key. So when that van of people shows up, are you going to raise your prices? No. This is not a good time for the business to raise its prices. It's not like the business is just absolutely thriving or anything. There's still tons of idle resources. So when the van comes in, you say, well, sit them down and let's feed them. Let's keep business as usual. Let's just deal with these new customers that come in. So the response here by the people running the restaurant is simply to meet the demand by serving these new customers. And don't change the price. Because think about this at the micro level. If your business is still producing less than its full potential, it's not a good time to raise the price. If you raise the price, you're probably going to lose some customers. You want to raise prices when the economy is great, when your business is doing fantastic. That's when you might want to raise prices. But here you don't need to. There's really not a good argument for why you want to raise your prices now. So businesses maintain their same prices. They simply just feed the customers. This is how Keynes saw the economy. When the economy is producing way below its potential, like it is here, and aggregate demand increases, the economy simply just produces more. All right? So from a macroeconomic perspective, the way this looks is there are millions of businesses out there. And when aggregate demand rises, the businesses just go out and hire more employees. And it's really easy to hire employees because there are so many of them unemployed. Once they hire the unemployed workers, they end up using some of that capital that wasn't used before. You know, I hire somebody to this office that's been unused, and I say, all right, you're my new employee. There's already a computer sitting there for you. So when the workers get hired, the capital gets used too, and all the idle resources start to become used. They're not idle anymore. So this is what Keynes imagined. When aggregate demand increases, real GDP goes up, but the businesses don't change their prices. So aggregate supply ends up being flat up to a point. Okay, so that explains the flat portion here. All along the flat portion, there are idle resources. So if aggregate demand moves along it, they're not going to change the prices. They're simply just going to change the quantity they're producing. So that is the flat portion. Let's now get to the vertical portion of it. So now let's focus on the vertical portion. Here's our real GDP. Here's our CPI. Okay, well, I'm drawing the wrong graph here. I've got to make sure I'm doing this in the Keynesian sense. Keynesian aggregate supply curve looks like this, right? Flat and then vertical. We explained that flat portion already, so now let's focus on the vertical. Let's imagine our aggregate demand is here at 81. So the first thing I'm going to make sure I do is I draw out my equilibrium. This is my real GDP, which is equal to my natural real GDP. And here's my CPI. Okay. According to Keynes, we're maxed out here. There's no way to produce more. Okay? In fact, at AD1, the economy is at its full capacity. There are no idle resources. Okay? And when I say no idle resources, that's being a bit exaggeratory, but essentially what we're saying here is the unemployment rate is less than or equal to 4.5%. So there aren't any employees out there that should be working that aren't, meaning there's no cyclical unemployment. There may be some structural and some frictional, but that's okay. That needs to happen, okay? We're not changing that part of the story. Structural and frictional unemployment should occur. So all we're saying now is there's no cyclical. All the unemployment remaining is natural, okay? So unemployment rate is at or less than 4.5%. So remember in classical we assume full production, best case scenario is 4.5%. That's because we don't really see inflationary gaps as being a good thing, they're a problem. For Keynes, anything less than 4.5%, less than or equal to, is equally good because inflationary gaps are fine in the short run, and that's all Keynes cares about is the short run. In the long run, we're all dead. So there are no idle resources. Everything is being used. So getting back to that metaphor, okay, what would this restaurant look like now? This restaurant is completely full. Everyone is working. All of the tables are filled up. The bar is completely filled up. There's no way for this business to produce anymore. So it is producing at maximum capacity. So let's imagine what happens if aggregate demand rises even further. So what happens if aggregate demand increases? What happens if a van load of people shows up? Okay? If aggregate demand increases to AD2, think about what you would do if you're a business owner. You've got a business that's at full capacity every single night. Okay? Can't produce any more. And somebody shows up, right? Demand increases even more. We've got a van load of people coming in. You can't produce anymore because we're maxed out. So that's why this is vertical. That's why it can't go any further. We can't produce anymore. We're maxed out. Now you might be thinking, well, you could expand your business. The problem is, think about that in terms of macroeconomics. To expand your business would mean you'd have to go out and find a new building. If the economy is maxed out, there are no buildings available. All right? You might be thinking, well, you could hire a construction crew. Yeah, but if you hire a construction crew, that construction crew can't do what they were doing before. And the economy's maxed out, so they were definitely already working. So there's no way for the economy to produce anymore, okay? There's no way for the economy to produce anymore. It's already maxed out. So that's why this part is vertical. So thinking about it from a business, if you're completely packed all the time and then people continue to come into your restaurant, you can't produce anymore. But you know what you can do? You can raise the price. After all, if you have a line of people out the door wanting to consume your products, you can raise your price and still be at max capacity. So that's what this looks like here on our graph. CPI rises to CPI 2, okay? Because if aggregate demand increases from 81 to 82, real GDP cannot increase. But CPI can. And businesses will do exactly that. They'll raise their prices. Now, to be careful here, a lot of students look at this and they say, this is bad. They look up here and they say, CPI going up, that's bad. I wouldn't really say that. After all, a little bit of inflation is good, right? Between 0 and 10% inflation is what we're aiming for. So the CPI going up, can't really call that a good or a bad thing. It depends, right? It depends on the scenario we're in. I would really call this a non-issue in most cases. The key, what we really care about is what's going on down here, the real GDP. And the economy is still at maximum production. So this hasn't helped or hurt things. It's just a change in the CPI. Okay, so that's why we have the vertical portion. So now we've explained the flat and we've explained the vertical, and you know what aggregate demand is like. So we've really explained everything already in regards to this graph. The last thing I want to do to tie all of this together is to think about how the government should get involved. So here's Keynes's recommendation. To fixing a recessionary gap. Okay? And so let's first start out by drawing a recessionary gap. I would really recommend that you practice this. Make sure you've got it down. Okay? If you're taking this class online, I know you're not drawing any graphs or anything and turning those in at the moment at least. But it's hard to understand this until you start playing around with them yourself. So here's our aggregate supply. Flat and then vertical. We just explained why that would be the case. And if we're in a recessionary gap, here's what it looks like. Here's aggregate demand. And here are our key variables. This is what we really care about, is what's going on down here. There's our natural. Here's our actual real GDP. And here's our CPI. So there's where our economy is at that CPI. So our economy is producing less than its full potential. Classical economists would say this would fix itself, wages and prices would adjust, those steps that we showed back in chapter 9. Keynes doesn't believe in that because he's not sure those assumptions would hold. So maybe wages and prices don't adjust. So here's his recommendation. As you saw before, Keynes recommends expansionary fiscal policy. That's the key. Cut taxes and or raise government spending. So do one of those things or do both of those things, okay? And the result is that's going to boost aggregate demand. And lead the economy to full production. Lead the economy to full employment, full production, get rid of all those idle resources, right? We got a lot of people right now not working, a lot of capital not being used. And here's how this is going to work. So let's imagine an example here. Let's say government cuts taxes by $3 million. How much is that going to boost aggregate demand by? Well, it's going to be more than 3 million because remember, the multiplier effects, okay? We've got multiplier effects. So what happens is the initial aggregate demand increase is the 3 million. All right, so I'm going to call this AD2, okay? But I'm drawing it as a dotted line just so you realize this doesn't really exist because as soon as the aggregate demand increases, we get the multiplier effects too. All right, but this is the amount the government has done. This represents the $3 million the government has spent, okay? So that's the $3 million that the government has spent, or I guess technically in this case, has cut taxes by, okay? That's going to raise aggregate demand because if you cut taxes, people have an extra $3 million in disposable income, money they weren't expecting to get. So let's imagine that in this question, let's say that the MPC is equal to 0.9. Then how much total spending is this going to generate? We got to figure out the multiplier, which is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. Right? 1 divided by 1 minus the MPC, which comes out to 10. So total spending, in this case, will increase by 10 times the 3 million, which is 30 million. So this ends up being a much bigger effect than you would initially expect because of all the multiplier effects. So what ends up happening is aggregate demand increases by a lot more. And this gap here between that dotted aggregate demand curve and this new one is 27 million. Now why is it 27 million? Why is it not 30 million? Well, the 3 million's here. That's the initial amount, okay? We get 30 million in total. So it's 3 million initially, and then 27 million is the multiplier effects on top of that, for a total of 30 million. So Keynes believed that if the economy was in a recessionary gap, the government was going to have to do something like this, either cut taxes or raise government spending to push the aggregate demand out to end the recessionary gap. So in this case, the real GDP would rise, and we'd now be at the full level, and perhaps the CPI would go up too. So that's what Keynes would recommend. And that pretty much wraps it up for Chapter 10. Honestly, though, there's a lot more that we need to discuss about classical and Keynesian economics, and we're going to get a chance to do that in the upcoming chapters. The very next chapter we're going to cover is Chapter 18, which looks at the Great Recession. The last big recession we went through from 2007 to about 2010 is when we were in a clear recessionary gap in our economy. So we're going to talk about what happened, what caused that, and then we'll be able to say, how did we deal with this problem? Did we do classical economics or did we do Keynesian economics? So we're going to look at that. And then after Chapter 18, we'll do Chapter 11, which discusses fiscal policy in much greater detail. So that's the end of chapter 10, but we're certainly not done with what we've learned in this chapter.